family, son.
That intro with Jack sure hits differently after the events of Village. So I recently revisited Resident Evil 7, which I've been meaning to do since playing Resident Evil Village. In the video I did on Village, I mentioned I felt the base game of Village was better than the base game of 7. I wanted to give that a closer examination to see if that still holds true. As well, there were a few game modes in Resident Evil 7 that I didn't cover in my previous video on the title, that being Madhouse, Ethan Must Die, and Jack's 55th birthday. So I'm making a follow-up video now to take a look at these. If you haven't watched my first video on Resident Evil 7, I'd recommend it. Do know it's a long one, just under an hour, and same with my video with Resident Evil Village. Do note there will be spoilers for Resident Evil 7 and Village in this video. Oh, and this time I'll make sure to spell Boulder right. In my video on Resident Evil 7, one of the first comments and many comments I got afterwards mentioned I spelled Boulder wrong in the title, so let's make up for that. When Capcom made Resident Evil 7, it's clear that the developers were aiming for an experience that harkened back to the original titles, not just in location and presentation, but in the sense of progression and item management. When they made Village, they tried a mixture of these elements with the more action-oriented approach in 4. Along the way, some compromises had to be made. While it does have a greater variety on a number of fronts, from enemies to locations, Village did lose some of that consistent tone that 7 had. The greatest flaw I had with Village was how they changed item management, so what they created from the series' origin worked so well and worked perfectly in 7. The removal of the item boxes and having items like crafting or key items not take up item slots greatly reduced the item management portion of Village. One of the main reasons the old titles work so well is having to plan your next excursion, what you're going to take with you. And they were able to move away from it starting at 4 with the action-heavy focus, which worked, due to how the level design changed to mostly linear fares away from the looping level design. In Village, the looping level design could have allowed for item boxes to be present, yet they weren't. I couldn't find anything about if the development team ever were going to include them at one point, but I can't help but wonder if they did. Because something was lost here in Village that didn't need to be. I understand it's going to be a much trickier balance with the greater emphasis on combat and enemies, and who knows, COVID did throw a major wrench in every developer's plans. Maybe that played a part. But the removal of the item box really did take away a lot from Village, even if I mostly enjoyed my time with the game. So in returning to Resident Evil 7, in my first video I mentioned I didn't feel like the game went far enough with item management. There weren't that many situations where I was thinking of what I need to take next with me, that perhaps the game was a bit too generous with how many item slots it gave you, along with the upgrades in size that you could pick up. Well, I guess that's where Madhouse comes into play, because I had to be much more aware of what I wanted to take with me amongst other things. So yeah, Madhouse is fantastic. It breathes fresh air into the game, and not just a difficulty bump in regards to enemies. The change up in item placement and choice and progression keeps you on your toes and gets you looking at a familiar space in a different way. It's somewhat like how in the first game you had a different route through the mansion depending on whether you're playing as Chris or Jill. There are many more antique coins for us to pick up and more unlocks in the bird cages. You could get the scorpion key in the main hall with a few coins, allowing you to bypass a portion of the main house that you would have had to do before. And that makes things a lot easier, because holy Christ does Jack move fast here. He moves faster than you run, so good luck if he sees you.
You're wasting your time! I don't know what you ever saw in you.
Now there's a technical flaw that Resident Evil 7 has that the other titles haven't had since, which can make replays, and Madhouse especially, a frustrating experience. That being the lack of being able to skip cutscenes. So to go through the intro, it takes some time. Now I know where to have a save file for after that first encounter with the bakers at dinner or Mia coming at us with the chainsaw. It's too bad you can't skip the cutscenes in Resident Evil 7. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the cutscenes. In fact, they're excellent and well acted. It could be just frustrating to have to try a part over and over and not be able to skip cutscenes. Now the game greatly cuts back on checkpoints, and now saving has become a limited function where we need cassettes to save, like ink ribbons from the other titles. So we have to give some thought into saving and if it's worth it. Granted, Madhouse is fairly generous with cassette tapes, so it wasn't too much of an issue. But this combination of limited saves and limited checkpoints, while higher stakes, can make a few situations a bit frustrating. For example, the garage fight with Jack. The first time around I saved a bit back, having to get the knife from the deputy, then going to the garage. After another run, I realized that mistake and saved just before.
A fucking pocket knife?
Because again, holy Christ, Jack will run at you like you wouldn't believe, and you have to be very precise in this garage fight to win against him. But it's once we get to the main hall that we could truly explore and change up in how we progress through the house. course, Resident Evil 7 on Madhouse will throw other hurdles our way, with how many enemies we encounter and where. Oh, and thanks to Village and of necessity, I learned the importance of blocking. On my previous video on Resident Evil 7, I got a number of comments mentioning my lack of blocking. Guilty as charged. Madhouse really showed me the value of blocking. You'll be dead before you know it otherwise. And since you need to have beaten the game before to get Madhouse mode, depending on how you do, you'll have unlockables to make things easier, like the additional gun or coin to raise your defense. Now, of course, these coins which you can get will take up slots, so you have to consider again if it's worth it and which one to get. The greater number of antique coins and the number of bird cages we do create more opportunities and builds that we can make use of. Also, the amount of separating agents you can get really changes the scope of things, and deciding on what you want to make, whether health kits, ammo, you have to be weighing out those risks. Oh, and having the knowledge of having beat the game on normal, I would have loved for the developers to give us the option of shooting the old Eve and cut to the end credits. The old house does have changes as well, with the trailer getting us the grenade launcher. And while I'm disappointed that Marguerite was lacking a bigger presence in the old house, the fight with her is not only the game's highlight, one of the highlights of the series in my mind, especially on Madhouse. Knowing that it was coming, deciding what to take with me, having lots of verticality and shortcuts in that house, I barely squeaked by a victory, using most of my ammo in the process. In a way, it reminded me of my first playthrough of Resident Evil 4, having just barely survived the water room with little ammo to spare.
Poor Evie's gonna be heartbroken. Come on now with me. We're gonna settle this.
And it's from here that the game does take the quality dive. Not a huge drop, but that's something that Village didn't suffer as heavily. Resident Evil titles have tended to struggle with this, and the section with Lucas and then the ship, while still fine, pale in comparison to before. And there's much less variety in how you want to tackle these compared to Madhouse on the old house and the main house. After revisiting 7 after Village, it's very noticeable how much smaller 7 is. I'm wondering what the size difference is between the two. As we've seen time and time again with open world games having a dick measuring contest with how big their worlds are, it doesn't exactly mean better quality. The design of Resident Evil 7 is much smaller in scope, more intricate, and has very little wasted space. Sure, there was a lot more variety in Village, and there was a lot of great exploration, but there were a few portions I felt could have perhaps reduced in size in some areas and made them more intricate. For example, I think the Village could have used more of this in some of Heisenberg's factory. A lot of the houses in the Village were hard to distinguish from one another. I wouldn't have minded if they blocked off more in them and put more time and care into a fewer amount. Another mode that I didn't cover in my last video is Ethan Must Die. It's an extremely tense, frustrating, addicting mode that will have you going just one more run each time you die. The name is fitting, as you will be dying plenty here. So we have to craft out that run to get to the end. Enemy placement doesn't change, but the items we get will. Item boxes will spawn the same locations, although some runs boxes won't spawn there. And the box will vary in stars. More stars, better items. But you also have to be careful, because these boxes may have explosives in them, and depending on what items you pick up, one explosion is enough to take you down. Some runs, the item gods will bless you with weapons, other times you might get stuck with gunpowder and no other weapons besides your knife. That's part of the fun, seeing what you could make the most of with what you've got. As enemy location doesn't change, you'll slowly make your way forward. What once took you a few runs, now you could do without is sweat. The sweat starts to drip when you reach a new area for the first time. What's it going to be there? Where will enemies spawn? What kind of traps are there? It's utterly thrilling. At these points I'm crouching and very slowly moving to see what enemies or traps will pop up. The biggest issue I had with Ethan Must Die is that I wish you could unlock shortcuts if you wanted to for further runs. Sure, that would remove some of these stakes, but I did find it a bit frustrating to run through areas that I can now do in my sleep over and over again. Could have been another decision we could make. Take the shortcut but miss out a whole batch of items that can make your run easier. But I kept coming back to it, even though it kicked my ass over and over, just to craft out that perfect run. And for the upcoming DLCs for Village, I'd love for them to take another crack at this kind of mode, because Ethan Must Die is an excellent addition. While Resident Evil 7 keeps a mostly dark tone and keeps the dark humor, the game lets its hair down with Jack's 55th birthday. Playing as Mia, the goal is to feed Jack by picking up dishes throughout the house. You can combine the ingredients to create dishes that will fill him up quicker, like a cheesecake.
Okay.
Before we begin, we could choose what to take, not just weapons, but also stat boosts. More which can be unlocked by completing runs if we score higher rank by finishing them sooner. These stat boosts, of course, take up slots in our inventory, so we have to consider as well how much to take while ensuring we have enough space to collect food to bring to Jack. It's a silly mode that makes great use of item management in Resident Evil 7, and it's nice to play a few rounds to get into the swing of things, and also to relax a bit. It definitely lets its hair a lot more down.
I don't think I can eat anymore.
So after this revisit, which do I hold as the better title? After playing Village, I said that I felt Village was the better base game, but overall with all its excellent DLC, 7 is the better title right now. But coming back to revisit the base game of Resident Evil 7, I'm not so sure. While Village didn't have as many quality drops that 7 suffered from, especially once we get to the ship, and had much more variety, it doesn't quite have the consistent tone and intricate design that 7 has. Sure, 7 was the testing grounds for what was the new game engine at the time for Capcom with the RE engine, but the smaller design of the world makes for less wasted space. And while 7 lacks much of the weapon upgrade options or builds we could do, it does have something that Village lacks, and that is the inclusion of item boxes. When this is removed from Village, it removes one of my favorite mechanics of the Resident Evil series, and ones that they've always done better than any other game. However, with replays, the lack of skipping cutscenes in 7 is frustrating, especially in the early portion of the game, whereas in Village you could cut right through them. But 7's hardest difficulty, Madhouse, is better designed than the Village of Shadows difficulty setting in RE Village. What makes 7 the better choice is allowing us to make different approaches to the critical path due to some item placement changes, whereas Village keeps them the same. So it really comes down to if you prefer the more classic style of item management with limited spaces, versus Village, which mostly pushed that to the background. So overall, I do think the base game of 7 is better. Now, I am curious to see what they do with RE Village when it comes to DLC. After all, the DLC for 7 was some of the best around I've encountered.